At the beginning of this semester, we learned from Christenberry and Lindblom that one of the ELA teaching models was teaching as inspiration, which relied lightly on planning and heavily on how the learning developed in the moment. No matter what teaching model a teacher adopts, I see a lot of teaching as inspiration choices during full class discussions, especially during literary discussions. Examples would be moments like these. What did you think of the story, or the poem, or the play? Does everybody understand? Yes? Okay, let's move on. Does anybody have any questions? No? Okay, let's move on. Does anybody want to point out a significant image or a significant theme? No? Okay, let's move on. Often I will notice a teacher or intern leading a discussion with 5 to 7 questions that will serve as the framework to drive an hour's worth of conversation. But here's the thing. Most adolescent students don't know how to have a literary conversation. They don't know how to discuss writing in a productive way. So they're conditioned to think that there's a right answer and that we, the teachers, expect them to give a right answer, and not knowing how to respond to discussion questions, they choose to just not respond. And what can happen as a result is that what we plan to do in an hour's worth of conversation actually gets finished up in about 10 minutes. So even though I have not assigned you to read the 9th chapter in Christenberry and Lindblom's text, I'm going to list it as a supplemental resource for this week's lessons, and I encourage you to read it because leading a discussion is not only about covering the necessary concepts or topics, it's also about knowing what questions to ask and knowing how to ask them. And it's also about enabling the students to engage in the subject matter with appropriate scaffolding from us. So in this video, I'm going to offer you some advice about leading discussions using web conferencing technologies, but please also keep in mind that the recommendations and the best practices of leading these discussions are also applicable in a face-to-face environment. So let's get started. I hope you have a group of students who are enthusiastic about real-time discussions. If you do, though, you'll find it challenging at first to keep track of the different students who want to share as well as the posts that come up on the chat feature. Depending on the size of your class, you might not be able to see everyone at once. So establishing a set of norms and then being consistent with them will help you ensure that everyone has the chance to participate. The following suggestions might help you decide on the web conferencing norms that will work best with your group of students. Communicate how you want students to respond to the topics and questions in your discussion and hold the students to those expectations. Will they use the raised hand feature on the web conferencing platform, or will they wave physically at the camera? Do you want students to keep their microphones muted until it's their turn to speak? If so, remind them of that at the beginning of every discussion. I certainly recommend this. In fact, in several web conferencing platforms, the leader can mute the participants if they forget to do that themselves. Can students assist you with communication management? Maybe students can take turns monitoring the chat feature, and then when a new comment pops up, the student assistant can alert you via private message. By the same token, students could take turns monitoring the participants' tiles on the screen. Has a student been trying to ask a question but been waiting for a while? Your student assistant could alert you about that via private message. Most web conferencing platforms include features for users to contribute via chat or vocally. These features are very useful in a full class discussion, but along the lines of establishing norms, you might think of the consistent ways you would like your students to use the chat feature as a complement to participating vocally. Shy students will gravitate toward that chat feature, and there's no problem with that as long as we don't make it easy for them to hide behind the chat features. Asynchronous discussion boards already offer sufficient opportunity for students to discuss their concepts in written form. And while it's nice to enable students to express themselves in writing using the chat feature, it's always helpful to hear a student's tone of voice and see nonverbal communications. Web conferencing is the student's chance to pose spontaneous questions or comments and respond immediately to the path that the conversation is taking. We teachers should encourage students to join into the vocal conversation as well as the chat conversation to demonstrate that all voices lend a valuable contribution to the conversation. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, many adolescent students don't know how to have a discussion about literature or a productive conversation about writing. In order for students to remain actively involved in the learning environment, they need something to do, and that something will enable them to converse about the topic at hand. The task that you give them can be something to do at the opening of the discussion, or it can be a task to complete prior to the discussion in the form of an entrance ticket. Either way, that measurable, observable task can be a springboard for students' participation in a discussion. Let's say that your class is going to discuss 3 poems by Emily Dickinson. If you want to give them an entrance ticket, you could inform the students ahead of time which poems they're going to be discussing. Give them a chance to prepare for that discussion by asking them to find an interesting background fact about each poem. You could ask them to make a list of all the words or passages that they didn't understand in the poems that they read. You could have them identify the lines where Dickinson makes use of inverted syntax or some other distinguishing feature of her poetry. You could have them draw a sketch note of how they made meaning of Dickinson's poems. Those are just some examples of entrance tickets that you could have them create, but there's a wide assortment of options you could choose. If you wanted to give them an observable task at the opening of the discussion, you could use the polling feature in your web conferencing platform. For an Emily Dickinson poem, you could have them respond to a question asking about the emotional reaction they had to the poem. You could also have students engage in a small group discussion using breakout rooms in which students answered a teaser question. And that discussion of the teaser question could be the way that you segue to the full group discussion. You could have students write a short, focused free write about the poetry to share later in the full group discussion. But what if you're teaching writing? Maybe your discussion would revolve around the effective ways to write introductory paragraphs. You might, for example, have students prepare for the discussion by having them write down the reasons that they find lead paragraphs difficult or easy to write. You could have them look up the term inverted pyramid and draw a diagram of it. You might have them read a short passage about openings written by a notable writer and have the students write a reflection on that passage. Or you could have them compose a rough draft of a thesis statement so that the class can work toward composing a lead paragraph for that thesis. Whenever I plan to discuss any topic with my students, I give them a measurable, observable task to complete either ahead of time or at the beginning of the discussion, and that task serves as the gateway toward a full group discussion. At first glance, this measurable, observable task might seem like busy work to the students or just one more thing that they have to do. But when students come to the discussion with their completed tasks, then they have something to talk about, something to share, something to refer to in the conversation, and that content helps the online conversation move toward the learning objectives. A few minutes ago, I mentioned how some shy students tend to rely heavily on the chat feature in a web conferencing application. This measurable, observable task that I just explained can encourage the vocal interaction that can keep the conversation lively. If students are reluctant to volunteer their ideas, we can call on them by name. For instance, we could say, Janelle, how did you respond to that image of the narrow fellow in the grass? Or, Blake, we haven't heard from you yet. What's the most significant detail in your sketch note? Can you share it with us? If students have completed those measurable tasks, then they don't have to worry about coming up with an answer on the spot, and the teacher can use those activities as gateways for these shyer students to join in. Many teachers will react to that recommendation about a measurable task with a note of caution. We don't want to make the students uncomfortable. We don't want to put them on the spot. And of course, my response to such concerns is complete agreement. Of course, we don't want to make students uncomfortable, but there's a big difference between encouraging students to participate and forcing them to participate. One way to encourage participation is to notice something that a student has done well and follow through with that learning success. So the examples on this screen might work when encouraging students to engage vocally. Tamika, you raised an interesting question on the chat feature, and I'd like to follow up on that. Are you asking about this? Todd, I saw you nodding when Daryl expressed his confusion about inverted syntax. Did you experience the same confusion, and can you tell me more about that? Denise, I noticed your thesis statement explains that you'll outline reasons in your essay, but you didn't list those reasons, and that's an effective way to express the main idea. Would you please share your thesis with the class? Cedric, your draft used really good examples, which you got from current events. How did you find those strong examples? Some teachers have offered students incentives such as participation grades to foster more interaction in online discussions. Those incentives can be effective as well. Use them as you can within your school's policies and parameters. In addition to having some shy students, you're probably going to have some students who are especially enthusiastic about participating in the conversation. So achieving balance in the discussion is going to be important. That balance will enable you to make sure that all voices get heard. You might create certain activities in order to balance conversations. For instance, you might ask a volunteer to comment first and then allow that volunteer to identify the next student who can add to the conversation. So the first student must pose a question for the next student to answer. However you create the opportunities for balanced active discussion, keep in mind that your goal is to encourage and not to force. If students shy away from the opportunity to speak, so be it. There might be a consequence to that choice, for instance, a deduction of credit from a participation grade or an inability to get the student's paragraph reviewed. But that consequence can remain private between you and the student. Just as in face-to-face classrooms, students are often reluctant to participate for fear of being wrong. So do think about ways to encourage students to join the discussion even if they're not confident in their answers. Vocalize the value of learning from mistakes. Here are some ways that I have facilitated active, balanced discussions in my web conferencing sessions. As students enter the digital room, I have them respond to a poll that is relevant to the topic of the day. And then once the poll is complete, I explain the results to the students and ask for reactions to those results. Sometimes I begin the discussion with a reminder about the measurable task that they completed, and as students share what they created and respond with follow-up questions, the conversation develops from there. Instead of quizzing students on the assigned topic, I might tell them ahead of time that they will write the quiz. Their entrance ticket to the discussion can be their quiz question. They can read their quiz question to the class and select a classmate to attempt an answer, or they can type their quiz question to the chat feature. Third-party platforms can be other ways to generate interaction in a synchronous discussion. Google Suite is especially helpful for such activities, but other apps can work as well. Using such third-party tools can open opportunities for students to discuss and show their critical thinking skills. Jamboard, for instance, is a nice way to foster multiple simultaneous responses. Part of the Google Suite, Jamboard is just that, a virtual whiteboard designed for group work. If I share my screen to reveal a Jamboard that I've also shared with my students, then we can post a topic on the board or a diagram on the board, and students can add sticky notes, clip art, or drawings to show their responses to the topic or their contributions to the diagram. These Jamboard activities, of course, are similar to using the web conferencing chat feature, but a significant difference is that the responses on the Jamboard appear in one large visual space instead of popping up individually in list form. By using the Jamboard as a way to elicit student response, everybody can respond in writing, but then the teacher and the classmates can also respond orally, providing a multisensory aspect to the discussion. Activities like these also allow students to employ their spoken and written communication skills simultaneously. Of course, Google Docs enables students to compose and edit written works in a group setting. Sharing the screen on a web conferencing platform enables students to collaborate in drafting and revising written work in real time. Nearpod is another online tool that offers real-time online collaboration, as is Perusal, the no-cost reading annotation tool. That's another way to springboard literary discussion as students add their written comments to an online text. By sharing a Perusal document in the web conferencing platform, the class can talk about the literature as they annotate it at the same time. Small group discussions can also work well in web conferencing settings. Zoom, Google Meet, and Microsoft Teams have breakout rooms that can allow students to discuss topics more deeply or collaborate on formative assessments. Students can support each other in analyzing complicated poems, editing tangled sentences, composing paragraphs, or creating a diagram to reflect a specific concept. As with small groups in physical classrooms, designing these small group discussion tasks can take prep work. They need structure. Each student must have an observable, measurable role in the group, such as the timekeeper, the editor, the scribe, the reporter. The small group task must be set up in such a way that each student can actually fulfill his or her role. Similar dynamics work in digital and physical learning environments. Students are more inclined to vocalize their knowledge with a small group than they are in front of an entire class. So just as the teacher can circulate a classroom to check in on each group, a teacher can visit each breakout room to support each small group's progress. Try these ideas for small group work in a synchronous discussion. Let's say that students are reading a work of literature. Assign the students to small groups and give each group a different topic about that work of literature, and then after a reasonable amount of time, say 7 to 10 minutes, bring the class back to full group discussion and have each group's reporter explain what their group discussed. Or, after reviewing an essay draft as a full group, assign the students to small groups and instruct each group to analyze the essay according to its strengths and opportunities. Or you could have each small group review a specific paragraph of that essay and then report back in full group discussion. Finally, after a full group discussion on sentence building, you can assign students to small groups to collaborate on sentence building exercises. Small group work can use third-party apps as well. I'll use the Jamboard again as an example. In small groups, students could compare and contrast two characters in a work of literature and then create a Venn diagram to illustrate their thinking about those characters. The suggestions I outlined in this video, of course, will be as successful as your required platforms allow them to be. I can't account for all the differences from one school to another, but I recognize that while some schools might have a subscription to Zoom that allows for all these different features, other schools might rely on a certain version of Microsoft Teams that doesn't include all of those features. I recognize that my experiences and examples come from what could be described as best case scenarios. In fact, I've heard anecdotes and observed teaching demonstrations, for instance, that revealed school-issued leniencies or limitations that added challenges to leading synchronous digital discussions. For instance, students in some systems have been allowed to participate in online discussions without using their cameras or their microphones. Students have been allowed to participate in online discussions via phone instead of computer. In some cases, teachers have been advised not to call on students by name in web conferencing settings. Teachers in some systems have been advised not to rely on third-party applications. Some teachers have been required to instruct using the web conferencing platform for the entire class period, and then other teachers have been required to teach in hybrid learning environments in which they have a cohort of students in the physical classroom while other students have joined in via web conferencing. Every one of those examples has logical reasons, mainly to protect student privacy or to protect teacher privacy or to fulfill instructional needs in times of teacher shortage and nationwide emergency. In some cases, the reasons for these limitations have to do with the different ways that students are able to access technology remotely. Sometimes bandwidth limitations impede a student's ability to use a camera. Sometimes a student's computer specifications at home limit his or her ability to access third-party applications. While school administrators must do the best they can, we must still recognize that these leniencies and restrictions make it difficult to lead productive real-time discussions. But the challenges should not deter us from trying to help students remain actively involved in the learning process. If a student is not required to use a microphone, we might still encourage her to use it so that she can learn more. As with any other aspect of planning and implementing instruction, leading synchronous online discussions comes with its advantages and its disadvantages. As we make these digital conversations part of our regular instruction, we have an opportunity to collect student learning data and then make adjustments to our instructional strategies to help students learn more. I've taught face-to-face, online, and hybrid, and I recently had the pleasure of teaching one specific student in two separate classes. One class was online and the other was face-to-face. In the face-to-face class, she sat in the back of the room, speaking only when spoken to, and even then, only in one-word answers. In the online class, she participated actively on discussion boards, responding to classmates' comments and questions and writing with specific detail. She showed strong critical thinking in that online class. My observation of her in those two settings helped me to see that her shyness could be alleviated in an online setting. I also noticed how she preferred to express herself in written rather than spoken form. So this one example illustrated to me that some students thrive in online settings while others thrive in face-to-face settings. All of them deserve the chance to succeed. So if we can offer the instructional settings that allow them that success, then why not? Online discussions can be a form of differentiation. We learn in our teacher preparation programs that we should communicate content in multiple ways. We should give students multiple forms of learning engagement and let them express their knowledge in multiple ways. Synchronous discussions open windows to differentiation strategies, allowing us to leverage technology across teaching modalities to support student success. So as you move forward to your student teaching experience and your first year teaching, try some of these recommendations for setting up digital real-time discussions. Whether you're teaching online or face-to-face with the appropriate scaffolding, you can show students how to have literary conversations or discussions about writing that will not only help them refine their critical thinking and communication skills, but also help them prepare for digital and face-to-face conversations in the real world.